Sarah Martinez had been working at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions for 7 years when David Chen walked through the office doors on that rainy Monday morning in September. The company's CEO, Margaret Williams, introduced him as the new operations director during the weekly team meeting. David stood tall in his expensive navy suit, his confident smile sweeping across the room as he shook hands with each department head. "David comes to us from Sterling Enterprises," Margaret announced, her voice carrying the authority that had built the company from a small startup to a mid-sized marketing firm employing over 200 people. "He'll be overseeing our day-to-day operations and helping us streamline our processes for better efficiency." Sarah watched from her seat in the third row, noting how David's handshake lingered just a moment too long with each person, how his eyes seemed to be calculating something behind his practiced smile. As the head of client relations, she had seen many executives come and go, but something about David felt different. There was an intensity to him that made her slightly uncomfortable. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her corner office, a space she had earned through years of building strong relationships with their biggest clients. Her assistant, Jenny, knocked on the doorframe and entered with a stack of client files. "What did you think of the new guy?" Jenny asked, setting the files on Sarah's desk. Sarah looked up from her computer screen where she was reviewing the quarterly client satisfaction reports. "Too early to tell," she replied diplomatically, though she had noticed how David's gaze had lingered on her during the introductions. Not with romantic interest, but with the look of someone sizing up potential competition. The first signs of change came within David's first week. He scheduled individual meetings with each department head, starting with the more junior positions and working his way up. When Sarah's turn came on Friday afternoon, she walked into the conference room to find David seated at the head of the table, a thick folder open in front of him. "Sarah, please sit," he said, gesturing to a chair positioned at an angle that forced her to look up at him slightly. It was a subtle power play, but one she recognized immediately. "I've been reviewing your department's performance metrics," David continued, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Your client retention rate is impressive, 93% over the past 2 years. That's quite remarkable in this industry." Sarah nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "My team works hard to maintain those relationships. We believe in understanding our clients' needs before they even realize what they are." David leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Yes, I've noticed that your approach is quite informal. You seem to operate more on intuition and personal relationships rather than systematic processes." The criticism was delivered with a smile, but Sarah heard it clearly. "Our approach has consistently delivered results," she said evenly. "Client satisfaction scores have increased by 28% since I took over the department." Of course. David waved his hand dismissively. "I'm not questioning your past success. I'm simply suggesting that as the company grows, we need more structured, measurable approaches. Systems that don't rely so heavily on individual personalities." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had been through this before with previous executives who believed that everything could be reduced to spreadsheets and metrics. "Our clients appreciate the personal touch. In our exit interviews, they consistently mention the relationship aspect as their primary reason for staying with us. I'd like you to prepare a detailed analysis of your department's processes, everything from initial client contact through project completion. I want to understand exactly how you achieve these results so we can develop replicable systems." After the meeting, Sarah walked back to her office feeling unsettled. She had built her department's success on understanding that marketing wasn't just about campaigns and analytics, but about human connection and trust. Her team knew their clients' businesses intimately, often catching problems before they became crises and identifying opportunities that purely data-driven approaches might miss. Over the following weeks, David's presence became increasingly felt throughout the company. He instituted new reporting requirements, demanding weekly updates from each department that went into exhaustive detail about activities, metrics, and outcomes. The informal culture that had allowed for creative collaboration began to give way to rigid structures and hierarchies. Sarah noticed that several of her colleagues were adapting quickly to David's style, particularly Tom Harrison from the creative department and Lisa Park from analytics. They began using David's preferred terminology in meetings, adopting his systematic approach to presentations, and scheduling regular one-on-one sessions with him to discuss strategy. The real shift became apparent during the monthly company-wide meeting in October. Margaret Williams still officially ran the meeting, but David had somehow positioned himself as the de facto presenter for most agenda items. He stood at the front of the conference room, using a laser pointer to highlight various charts and graphs displayed on the large screen. "As we can see from these metrics," David said, clicking to a slide showing departmental performance comparisons, "there are significant opportunities for improvement in our operational efficiency. Some departments are achieving excellent results, while others are lagging behind in measurable outcomes." Sarah's department was listed in the middle of the pack, despite having the highest client retention and satisfaction scores. The metrics David had chosen to highlight emphasized things like response time to emails, number of client touchpoints per week, and documentation completion rates. These were administrative tasks that had little correlation with actual client satisfaction, but they were easily quantifiable. "Moving forward," David continued, "we'll be implementing standardized procedures across all departments. This will ensure consistency in our service delivery and make it easier to scale our operations as we continue to grow." After the presentation, Margaret approached Sarah near the coffee station. "How are you feeling about the new changes?" she asked, her voice carrying a subtle note of concern. Sarah chose her words carefully. Margaret had hired David, so criticizing him directly wouldn't be wise. "Change is always challenging," she said. "I'm concerned about maintaining the client relationships that have been so crucial to our success." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "David brings a lot of experience from larger organizations. Sometimes we need that outside perspective to take us to the next level." That afternoon, Sarah received an email from David requesting a meeting to discuss optimization opportunities in her department. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, giving her the weekend to prepare what she suspected would be a defense of her team's methods. As she gathered her files and prepared to leave the office that Friday evening, Sarah noticed that the lights were still on in David's office. Through the glass wall, she could see him on a phone call, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. There was something about his body language that suggested this wasn't just a routine business conversation. Jenny appeared at her desk, grabbing her purse from the drawer. "Mr. Chen asked me to compile a list of all our client contacts," she said quietly. "Names, phone numbers, email addresses, the works. He said it was for the new CRM system, but it seemed like an odd request." Sarah felt that familiar knot tightening in her stomach. "Did you give it to him?" "I told him I'd need your approval first," Jenny replied. "He didn't seem very happy about that." Sarah made a mental note to review what information David was requesting from her team. Something about his approach felt less like optimization and more like surveillance. She had worked too hard building trust with her clients to let it be undermined by someone who saw relationships as merely data points to be managed. The weekend passed quickly, and Monday morning arrived with an email from David moving their meeting to the larger conference room. When Sarah arrived, she found not only David waiting for her, but also Tom Harrison and Lisa Park. Their presence immediately put her on alert. "Sarah, thank you for joining us," David said, though his tone suggested this was more of a summons than an invitation. "I've asked Tom and Lisa to participate in our discussion because I believe their departments have developed some excellent systematic approaches that might benefit your team." Tom leaned forward eagerly. "We've been working on a standardized client communication protocol that ensures consistent messaging across all touchpoints. It's really streamlined our creative approval process." Lisa nodded enthusiastically. "And our new analytics dashboard provides real-time insights into client engagement metrics. We can track everything from email open rates to meeting satisfaction scores." Sarah listened politely, recognizing that both Tom and Lisa were essentially describing ways to quantify and control the very relationships that had made her department successful. When they finished their presentations, David turned to her with an expectant smile. "As you can see," he said, "there are proven methodologies we can implement to bring your department in line with company-wide standards. I'd like you to work with Tom and Lisa over the next 2 weeks to develop an implementation plan." Sarah felt the walls closing in. This wasn't a discussion about optimization, it was a systematic takeover of her department's operations. "I appreciate their insights," she said carefully, but I'd like to understand how these changes will impact our existing client relationships. Some of our longest-standing clients specifically value the personal approach we've developed. David's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. Change is never easy, Sarah, but it's necessary for growth. We can't let individual preferences hold back the entire organization's progress. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Tom and Lisa outlining various systems and processes that would fundamentally alter how Sarah's team interacted with clients. By the time it ended, Sarah realized that she was facing a choice: adapt to David's vision or find herself marginalized within her own company. As she walked back to her office, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from one of her most important clients, Rebecca Chen, the marketing director at TechFlow Industries. "Can we schedule a call this week? Having some concerns about our upcoming campaign and could use your perspective." Sarah smiled for the first time that morning. Rebecca's message reminded her why she had been successful in the first place. It wasn't about systems and metrics. It was about being available when clients needed guidance and having the expertise to provide valuable insights. She spent the rest of the morning calling 3 of her other major clients, conducting what David would probably classify as unstructured relationship maintenance activities. But in those conversations, she learned about a potential merger that would affect 2 of their campaigns, discovered a budget issue that needed immediate attention, and identified an opportunity for expanded services that could generate significant additional revenue. None of these insights would have emerged from David's systematic approach. They came from years of building trust and creating environments where clients felt comfortable sharing both their concerns and their ambitions. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision. Instead of fighting David's changes directly, she would document everything her team was already accomplishing through their relationship-based approach. She would gather the data that proved her methods weren't just effective, but superior to the systematic approaches being promoted. She called a meeting with her team for the following morning. Jenny, Marcus from account management, and Diana from project coordination gathered in her office, their faces showing the same concern that Sarah had been feeling. "I know everyone's been wondering about the changes happening around here," Sarah began. "David is implementing new processes across all departments, and we're going to need to adapt." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Are we going to have to start using those scripts that Tom's team developed? Because honestly, they sound pretty robotic." "We're going to find a way to maintain our effectiveness while meeting the new requirements," Sarah replied, "but I need everyone's help documenting exactly what we do and why it works." Over the next week, Sarah's team worked to quantify their approach in ways that David would understand. They tracked response times, documented client interactions, and created detailed reports showing how their relationship-based methods directly contributed to revenue generation and client retention. The data was impressive. Sarah's team had prevented 4 potential client defections in the past quarter by identifying and addressing concerns before they became problems. They had also identified expansion opportunities that had generated over $200,000 in additional revenue. Most importantly, their client satisfaction scores consistently outperformed every other department in the company, including Tom's creative team and Lisa's analytics group. Armed with this information, Sarah requested a meeting with Margaret Williams. She had decided it was time to present her case directly to the person who ultimately made the decisions about the company's direction. The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon. As Sarah prepared her presentation, she realized that this conversation would likely determine not just her future at the company, but the future of her entire approach to client relations. She had built something valuable at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions, something that couldn't be easily replicated through systems and processes. The question now was whether the company's leadership would recognize that value or whether David's vision of systematic efficiency would ultimately prevail. Friday arrived with an unseasonable warmth for late October. Sarah walked into Margaret's office carrying a thick folder of documentation and a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had the data to support her position. What she didn't realize was that David had requested his own meeting with Margaret scheduled for immediately after hers. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would reveal more about the true dynamics of power and leadership than anyone expected. Margaret Williams listened intently as Sarah presented her findings, occasionally asking questions about specific metrics or client interactions. The data painted a clear picture of a department that was not only meeting its goals but exceeding them in ways that directly contributed to the company's bottom line. "These are impressive numbers," Margaret said, leaning back in her leather chair as Sarah concluded her presentation. "Your team's approach is clearly working." Sarah felt a wave of relief. "Thank you. I wanted you to see that our methods, while perhaps less formal than what David is proposing, are producing measurable results." Margaret was quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against her desk. "David has scheduled a meeting with me right after this one. I suspect he has his own perspective on your department's performance." Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on Margaret's door. David entered without waiting for permission, his confident smile faltering slightly when he saw Sarah still seated across from Margaret's desk. "I'm sorry," he said, checking his watch. "I thought we were meeting at 3. "We are," Margaret replied calmly. Sarah was just finishing her presentation about her department's performance metrics. David's eyes flicked to the documents spread across Margaret's desk, and Sarah could almost see him calculating how this unexpected development might affect his planned conversation. "Actually," Margaret continued, "this might be a good opportunity for you both to discuss your different perspectives on operational efficiency." The next 30 minutes revealed the fundamental disconnect between David's systematic approach and Sarah's relationship-based methods. David presented charts showing inconsistencies in response times and documentation protocols, while Sarah countered with evidence of client satisfaction and revenue generation. "The issue," David said, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge, "is scalability. Sarah's approach might work for her current client base, but it's not sustainable as we grow. We need systems that can be replicated and managed consistently." Sarah remained calm, having anticipated this argument. "Our approach is absolutely scalable. In fact, 3 of our newer team members have already demonstrated they can build strong client relationships using these methods. The key is hiring people who understand that marketing is fundamentally about human connection." David leaned forward, his professional mask slipping slightly. "With respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that holds companies back. Personal relationships are unpredictable. They depend too heavily on individual personalities and can't be easily transferred or standardized. But they generate results," Sarah replied firmly. "Our client retention rate speaks for itself." Margaret intervened before the discussion could escalate further. "I appreciate both perspectives," she said diplomatically. "Let me review all of this information, and we'll schedule another meeting next week to discuss the path forward." As they left Margaret's office, David walked beside Sarah toward the elevator. His demeanor had shifted from professional courtesy to something more calculating. "You know," he said as they waited for the elevator doors to open, "I admire your passion for your clients, but sometimes we have to make difficult decisions for the greater good of the organization." Sarah recognized the veiled threat. "I believe the greatest good comes from maintaining the relationships that drive our success." The elevator arrived, and they rode down in silence. As the doors opened on Sarah's floor, David placed his hand briefly on her arm. "Just remember," he said quietly, "change is coming whether we embrace it or not. The question is whether we choose to be part of the solution or part of the problem." That evening, Sarah stayed late to catch up on work, the office quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Around 7 o'clock, she heard voices coming from the direction of Margaret's office. Curious, she walked toward the executive wing and saw that Margaret's office light was still on. Through the partially open door, she could hear David's voice, though she couldn't make out the specific words. What struck her was the tone, more animated and urgent than his usual controlled professional manner. Sarah retreated to her office, but the conversation bothered her. There was something about David's after-hours meeting with Margaret that felt significant, though she couldn't quite identify why. The following Monday brought news that clarified David's strategy. During the weekly team meeting, Margaret announced that David would be taking on additional responsibilities, including oversight of all client-facing departments. "This restructuring will help us achieve better coordination between our various client service functions," Margaret explained, though her voice lacked its usual enthusiasm. Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. This change essentially put David in a position to control her department's operations directly, rather than simply influencing them through company-wide policies. After the meeting, several colleagues approached Sarah privately to express their concerns. Marcus from her own team was the first. "This doesn't feel right," he said, keeping his voice low as they walked back to their offices. "David's been asking a lot of questions about our client relationships, and not just professional ones. He wanted to know which clients we socialize with, who we consider personal friends, that kind of thing." Jenny appeared at Sarah's office door shortly after. "I need to tell you something," she said, closing the door behind her. "David asked me to compile detailed reports on all your client interactions for the past 6 months. He specifically wanted to know about any off-the-record conversations or informal meetings." Sarah felt a chill. "Did you prepare the reports?" "I stalled," Jenny replied. "I told him the information was stored in multiple systems, and it would take time to compile, but he's getting impatient." That afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected call from Rebecca Chen at TechFlow Industries. Rebecca's voice carried an unusual tension. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. Has someone from your company been calling our other vendors asking questions about our business relationship?" Sarah's heart sank. "What kind of questions?" "Specific things about our contract terms, our satisfaction levels, even some details about our internal operations that we've shared with you in confidence. My assistant received 3 calls last week from someone claiming to be conducting a routine vendor assessment." Sarah closed her eyes, understanding immediately what was happening. "Rebecca, I can assure you that those calls didn't come from me or anyone on my direct team. Let me look into this and get back to you." "I hope so," Rebecca said. "Because if your company is sharing confidential information or using our business relationship for some kind of competitive intelligence gathering, we're going to have a serious problem." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her office trying to process the implications. David wasn't just implementing new systems. He was actively undermining the trust relationships that formed the foundation of her department's success. She spent the next 2 hours calling her other major clients, carefully asking if they had received any unusual inquiries. 3 of the 5 reported similar experiences. Someone claiming to represent Pinnacle Marketing Solutions had been contacting their other vendors and partners, asking detailed questions about their business operations and vendor relationships. Sarah realized she was facing something far more serious than a disagreement over operational methods. David was systematically compromising her client relationships, potentially creating legal and ethical issues that could damage not just her department but the entire company. That evening, she called Margaret's direct line, knowing the CEO often worked late. "Margaret, I need to discuss something urgent with you. It's about our client relationships and some activities that could expose the company to serious liability." Margaret agreed to meet early the next morning, before the regular business day began. Sarah spent most of the night preparing documentation of the client complaints and researching the potential legal implications of unauthorized vendor inquiries. When she arrived at Margaret's office at 7:30 the next morning, she found the CEO looking tired and stressed. "I have to ask," Margaret said before Sarah could begin her presentation, "are you absolutely certain about these allegations?" "I've spoken directly with 4 clients who received these calls," Sarah replied. "I can provide you with dates, times, and detailed descriptions of the information that was requested." Margaret listened as Sarah presented the evidence, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Sarah finished, Margaret was quiet for several long minutes. "This is exactly the kind of situation I was hoping to avoid," Margaret finally said. "David assured me that his investigation into our client relationships was purely internal and focused on operational efficiency." "Investigation?" Sarah felt her stomach drop. "You knew he was looking into our client relationships?" Margaret nodded reluctantly. "He expressed concerns about what he called informal relationship management practices and wanted to assess whether our client interactions met professional standards. I authorized him to review internal documentation and processes, not to contact clients directly." Sarah realized that David had exceeded his authority, potentially exposing both himself and the company to significant liability. But she also understood that Margaret's authorization of his investigation suggested a deeper level of distrust in her methods than she had realized. "Margaret, these clients trusted us with confidential information based on years of building professional relationships. If that trust is compromised, we could lose accounts worth millions in annual revenue. I understand the seriousness of the situation, Margaret replied. "Let me handle this internally. In the meantime, I need you to focus on damage control with your clients." Sarah left the meeting with mixed feelings. While Margaret seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, her response felt more focused on managing the immediate crisis than addressing the underlying issues that had created it. Over the next few days, Sarah worked to repair the damage with her clients, personally calling each one to explain that the vendor inquiries had been made without authorization and that the company was taking steps to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Most of her clients accepted her explanation, but the incident had clearly damaged their trust in the company. Rebecca Chen was particularly direct in her feedback. "Sarah, I've worked with you for 3 years, and I trust you personally, but this kind of mistake makes me question whether your company has the professional standards we require in our vendors." Meanwhile, David's presence in the office became increasingly tense. During team meetings, his usual confident demeanor was replaced by a more defensive posture. He began scheduling individual meetings with various staff members, sessions that employees described as feeling more like interrogations than collaborative discussions. Tom Harrison from the creative department approached Sarah during lunch one day, looking uncomfortable. "I think I made a mistake," he said quietly. "David asked me to review your department's client files and identify what he called relationship dependencies. I thought it was a legitimate operational analysis." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "What did you tell him?" "I identified which clients seemed to have particularly strong relationships with specific team members, thinking it would help with succession planning or something. But after what happened with those vendor calls, I'm wondering if I gave him information that he used inappropriately." That afternoon, Sarah received a call that changed everything. It was from Jennifer Walsh, the head of business development at Morrison Industries, one of Pinnacle's largest clients. "Sarah, I have some information that I think you need to know," Jennifer said. "I received a call yesterday from someone claiming to be a consultant hired by your company to assess vendor relationships. But here's the interesting part. The person asked specifically about you and whether we would be interested in maintaining our relationship if you were no longer with the company." Sarah felt the room spin slightly. Did the caller identify themselves? They said their name was David Chen and that they were conducting a strategic assessment for Margaret Williams. When I pressed for more details, they said they were evaluating potential changes in account management and wanted to understand client loyalty patterns. Sarah realized that David wasn't just trying to systematize her approach, he was actively working to undermine her position within the company. The vendor calls hadn't been about operational efficiency. They had been about testing whether clients would follow her if she left, or whether they were truly loyal to the company. After ending the call with Jennifer, Sarah sat in her office trying to decide her next move. She could confront David directly, but that would likely escalate the conflict without providing any real resolution. She could go back to Margaret, but their previous conversation suggested that the CEO was more concerned with managing the situation than addressing its root causes. Instead, Sarah decided to document everything carefully and begin building her own network of support within the company. If David was playing political games, she would need to understand the full scope of his influence before deciding how to respond. That evening, she stayed late again, but this time she wasn't alone. Jenny knocked on her office door around 7 o'clock. "I thought you should know," Jenny said. "David scheduled a meeting with Margaret for tomorrow morning, but he also scheduled something called a leadership assessment session for Friday afternoon. HR sent out invitations to what they're calling key stakeholders in client relationship management." The David seemed disappointed, as if the darling's accelerating his timeline. Whatever his ultimate goal, he was moving quickly to consolidate his position and marginalize her influence within the company. As she gathered her things to leave that night, Sarah noticed that the lights were on in David's office again. But this time, she could see through the glass that he wasn't alone. Margaret was there, along with 2 people Sarah didn't recognize, a man and woman in expensive suits who looked like they might be consultants or lawyers. The meeting appeared intense, with documents spread across the conference table and David gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Sarah couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language suggested that major decisions were being made. She left the office that night knowing that the situation was escalating beyond a simple disagreement about operational methods. Something larger was happening, and she was running out of time to understand what it was. and how to protect both her team and her clients from the consequences. The next morning brought an email that confirmed her worst fears. David had sent a company-wide message announcing a comprehensive review of all client relationship management practices and requesting that all employees report any irregular or non-standard client interactions directly to him. The message was professionally worded, but its intent was clear. David was creating a system of surveillance and control that would effectively eliminate the informal relationship-building activities that had made Sarah's department successful. As she read the email, Sarah realized that she was facing a choice that went beyond her own career. The approach she had developed wasn't just about her personal success. It was about a fundamental philosophy of how businesses should treat their clients and employees. The question now was whether she had enough support within the company to challenge David's vision, or whether his systematic approach to power accumulation had already made him too entrenched to oppose effectively. The answer would come sooner than she expected. The leadership assessment session that David had organized for Friday afternoon turned out to be more revealing than anyone anticipated, though not in the way he had planned. Sarah arrived at the large conference room to find not only the usual suspects, Tom Harrison, Lisa Park, and several other department heads, but also the two consultants she had seen meeting with David and Margaret earlier in the week. Margaret opened the meeting by introducing the consultants as representatives from Sterling Consulting Group, the same firm where David had previously worked. The coincidence was not lost on Sarah, and she could see similar recognition dawning on the faces of several colleagues. "We've brought in Sterling to conduct an independent assessment of our organizational effectiveness," Margaret announced, though her tone suggested this independence might be questionable. "They'll be evaluating our current practices and making recommendations for optimization." David stood to address the group, his confidence fully restored. "As part of this assessment, we'll be reviewing each department's contribution to overall company objectives. This includes analyzing client relationship management practices to ensure they align with industry best practices." Sarah noticed that several people in the room were exchanging glances. The atmosphere felt more like a tribunal than a collaborative planning session. The lead consultant, a woman named Patricia Stevens, took control of the presentation. She began outlining what she called relationship management inefficiencies within the organization, using terminology and examples that seemed suspiciously similar to David's earlier criticisms of Sarah's department. Modern client relationship management requires systematic approaches that can be measured, replicated, and scaled, Patricia explained, clicking through slides that emphasized metrics and standardization. Informal relationship-based methods, while perhaps well-intentioned, create vulnerabilities and inconsistencies that can undermine long-term growth. As the presentation continued, Sarah began to understand the larger strategy. David hadn't just been trying to change her department's methods. He had been building a case to bring in his former consulting firm to redesign the entire company's approach to client management. 20 minutes into the presentation, something unexpected happened. Jenny quietly entered the room and placed a note on Sarah's desk. The message was brief but urgent. Morrison Industries called. Emergency client meeting requested for Monday morning. Jennifer Walsh wants to discuss contract renewal. Sarah felt a chill. Morrison Industries was their largest client, representing nearly 20% of the company's annual revenue. If they were questioning their contract renewal, it could be directly related to the vendor inquiry calls that David had made. She discreetly checked her phone and found 2 additional messages, one from Rebecca Chen requesting an urgent call and another from the marketing director at Pinnacle Technologies expressing concerns about recent changes in communication protocols. Sarah realized that while David and the consultants were presenting their systematic approach to relationship management, the actual relationships that drove the company's success were beginning to unravel. She made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just a few weeks earlier. Standing up during Patricia's presentation, she addressed the room directly. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that drew everyone's attention. "But I think there's something this group needs to know before we continue this discussion." David's expression shifted from confidence to alarm. "Sarah, perhaps we could address your concerns during the discussion period." "This can't wait," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact with Margaret. "Our 3 largest clients have contacted me this week with serious concerns about recent changes in how we're managing their accounts. Morrison Industries has requested an emergency meeting to discuss their contract renewal." The room fell silent. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. What kind of concerns? Sarah had prepared for this moment, though she hadn't expected it to come during David's presentation. They've received unauthorized calls from someone claiming to represent our company, asking detailed questions about their business operations and vendor relationships. These calls have damaged their trust in our professional standards. Patricia Stevens looked confused. I'm not sure how this relates to our operational efficiency assessment. Sarah kept her focus on Margaret. It relates because the person making those calls was David, and he exceeded his authorized scope of investigation into our client relationships. David's face flushed red. That's completely out of line, Sarah. Those calls were part of a legitimate operational review that was authorized by Margaret. No, Sarah said calmly. According to Morrison Industries' business development director, you specifically asked whether they would maintain their relationship with our company if I was no longer their account manager. That's not operational review, that's corporate sabotage. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb. Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to anger, though it wasn't clear who the anger was directed toward. Tom Harrison, who had been one of David's strongest supporters, spoke up hesitantly. David, you asked me to identify what you called relationship dependencies in Sarah's client files. I thought it was for succession planning, but was it really for something else? David's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. Everything I've done has been in the best interest of the company. We need to move beyond personality-based relationship management to systematic approaches that don't create single points of failure. Sarah recognized the corporate speak for what it was, an attempt to justify actions that couldn't be justified through honest explanation. The only single point of failure I see, said a voice from the back of the room, is trusting someone who doesn't understand the difference between building relationships and exploiting them. It was Marcus from Sarah's team, who had apparently arrived late to the meeting, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Jennifer Walsh from Morrison Industries and Rebecca Chen from TechFlow Industries. Margaret looked stunned. I wasn't aware we had clients attending this meeting. Jennifer stepped forward, her expression serious but controlled. We weren't invited, but after comparing notes about the unusual calls we've been receiving, we felt it was important to understand what was happening with our vendor relationships. Rebecca nodded in agreement. 3 of us have received calls in the past 2 weeks from someone claiming to represent Pinnacle, asking questions that seemed designed to test our loyalty to specific account managers. It felt unprofessional and, frankly, unethical. Patricia Stevens looked at David with growing alarm. This wasn't part of the operational assessment we discussed. Our firm would never authorize direct client contact without explicit permission and proper protocols. Sarah realized that David had been operating independently, using his connection to Sterling Consulting Group as cover for actions that the firm itself wouldn't have endorsed. Margaret stood up, her authority reasserting itself. David, I need you to explain exactly what calls you made and under whose authority. David's response was telling in its defensiveness. I was trying to assess the true strength of our client relationships. Sarah's department operates through informal methods that create dependencies on individual personalities rather than systematic company-wide approaches. I needed to understand whether our clients were loyal to the company or just to specific employees. By potentially damaging those relationships? Jennifer asked incredulously. Do you understand that these kinds of inquiries make us question whether we can trust your company with confidential information? The meeting had completely derailed from David's original plan. Instead of showcasing the need for systematic relationship management, his actions had demonstrated the value of the trust-based approach that Sarah had developed. Rebecca addressed the room directly. I've worked with Sarah for 3 years. During that time, her team has helped us avoid 2 potential marketing disasters, identified expansion opportunities that generated significant revenue, and provided insights that helped us navigate a complex merger. That's not personality-based relationship management. That's professional expertise delivered through trusted partnerships. Marcus stepped forward with a folder in his hand. Sarah asked me to compile some data that might be relevant to this discussion. In the past year, clients managed by Sarah's team generated 37% more revenue per account than the company average. They also had 43% fewer service complaints and 62% higher satisfaction scores on post-project evaluations. Tom Harrison looked visibly uncomfortable. I think I owe Sarah an apology. David convinced me that her methods were somehow unprofessional or inefficient, but the results speak for themselves. Patricia Stevens was reviewing documents on her tablet, her expression growing more troubled. Margaret, I need to clarify something important. Sterling Consulting Group was retained to assess operational efficiency, not to evaluate individual employee performance or client loyalty. If Mr. Chen represented our engagement differently to you or to clients, he was exceeding our scope of work. David realized that his support system was collapsing. This is all being taken out of context. Modern organizations require systematic approaches to relationship management. You can't run a growing company based on informal relationships and personal connections. Sarah had been listening to the exchange, and she realized that this moment represented more than just a conflict between different management styles. It was about fundamental values and what it meant to lead effectively. David, I think you misunderstand what we do, she said, her voice calm but firm. We don't manage relationships. We build them. Our clients don't work with us because of our systems and processes. They work with us because we understand their businesses, we anticipate their needs, and we deliver results that matter to them. She turned to address the full room. Every systematic approach David has proposed focuses on controlling and measuring relationships as if they were production processes. But relationships aren't products to be manufactured. They're partnerships to be nurtured. Jennifer nodded emphatically. That's exactly right. Sarah's team doesn't just execute our marketing campaigns. They help us think strategically about our market position. They've become trusted advisors, not just service providers. Margaret had been listening intently, and Sarah could see her processing the implications of everything that had been revealed. When she spoke, her voice carried the decisive authority that had built Pinnacle Marketing Solutions into a successful company. I think we've learned enough for today, Margaret said. Patricia, I'll need a full report on your firm's actual scope of work and any communications you've had with David beyond that scope. David, I'll need to speak with you privately about your unauthorized client contacts. As people began to leave the conference room, Jennifer approached Sarah. We wanted you to know that this situation actually strengthened our confidence in working with you personally, but it raised serious questions about the company's management practices. We're hoping this gets resolved quickly. After the clients and consultants left, Margaret asked Sarah to remain behind. They sat alone in the large conference room, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, creating long shadows across the table. I owe you an apology, Margaret said. When David raised concerns about informal relationship management practices, I should have talked to you directly instead of authorizing what I thought was an internal operational review. I understand the pressure to systematize operations as the company grows, but some things can't be reduced to processes and metrics without losing their essential value. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, apparently wrestling with a decision. When she spoke, her words surprised Sarah. I've been thinking about succession planning for this company, Margaret said. Not because I'm planning to retire immediately, but because good leaders prepare for the future. David's approach demonstrated something important: the difference between managing systems and leading people. Sarah wasn't sure where the conversation was heading, but she sensed its importance. What David never understood, Margaret continued, is that you weren't just managing client relationships. You were demonstrating a form of leadership that I should have recognized and nurtured rather than questioned. Over the next hour, Margaret outlined her vision for the company's future. She had been considering David for a senior leadership role, but his actions had revealed fundamental flaws in his judgment and values. Instead, she wanted to discuss expanding Sarah's responsibilities beyond client relations to include oversight of the company's entire customer experience strategy. I'm not talking about promoting you to manage other departments, Margaret clarified. I'm talking about creating a new kind of leadership role that focuses on ensuring that our growth doesn't compromise the values that made us successful in the first place. Sarah realized that what had started as a threat to her department had evolved into an opportunity to influence the company's entire approach to business relationships. 2 weeks later, David submitted his resignation, citing philosophical differences about organizational direction. The Sterling Consulting Group engagement was terminated, and Patricia Stevens sent a formal letter clarifying that their firm had not authorized the client contact activities that had caused the controversy. Sarah's new role as Vice President of Client Experience put her in charge of not just relationship management, but also customer service, account development, and strategic partnerships. More importantly, it positioned her to ensure that the company's growth strategies remained grounded in the values of trust, expertise, and authentic partnership that had made them successful. 6 months later, Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was recognized by Industry Weekly as Marketing Firm of the Year, with specific recognition for their innovative approach to client relationship management. The article quoted several clients praising the company's commitment to understanding their businesses and delivering personalized solutions. Rebecca Chen was quoted in the article, "What sets Pinnacle apart is that they don't just work for you, they work with you. They understand that the best marketing comes from genuine partnerships built on trust and mutual respect." The recognition came with something even more valuable: 3 new major clients who specifically sought out Pinnacle because of their reputation for relationship-based service delivery. During the company celebration following the award announcement, Margaret pulled Sarah aside. "I learned something important from this whole experience," Margaret said. "I was so focused on what David was trying to take control of that I almost missed recognizing who was actually leading." Sarah smiled, understanding that the real victory wasn't in defeating David's systematic approach, but in proving that authentic leadership comes from empowering others and creating value that extends beyond any individual personality or position. The company had not just survived internal power struggle, it had emerged stronger by recommitting to the values that had made it successful in the first place. And Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important leadership happens not through taking control, but through demonstrating what real control, based on competence, integrity, and genuine care for others, actually looks like. As the celebration continued around them, Sarah reflected on how the situation had unfolded. David had tried to take control through systems, metrics, and political maneuvering, but real leadership, she had learned, came from building trust, delivering results, and empowering others to succeed. In the end, everyone had realized that she had been leading all along, not through authority or position, but through the kind of authentic influence that creates lasting value for everyone involved.